Elections in the United States are being watched not just in the US but around the world. American foreign policy impacts different parts of the world in profound ways. Joining us now, a very special guest. Carl Bildt is co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Affairs. He's also a former Prime Minister of Sweden. Mr. Bildt, wonderful speaking to you. Thank you very much for being with us.
Wonderful to be with you.
Is there a real concern, Mr. Bildt, in Europe that if Donald Trump comes to power, that funding, US funding for the war in Ukraine might come to an end?
There are serious concerns, I would say, on two different aspects of Trump policies. One is the one that you mentioned, the American commitment to the security of Europe, where defense of Ukraine at the moment is the most acute issue, but there are wider issues associated with that. And then there is concern with his trade policies. We are dependent upon foreign trade and open global economy, and we have no interest in global trade wars of the sort that his policies might lead to.
But let's talk a little bit more about Ukraine. I was in Kiev about a month and a half back, and I asked President Zelensky this question, saying that if Trump comes to power, how would things change? Because the war is in a critical phase. And he seemed to suggest that in his personal conversations with Trump, there wasn't anything evident immediately that that might be the case. Do you therefore believe that that could essentially be rhetoric leading up to these elections, that in terms of support for Ukraine may not necessarily end?
I think it will be very difficult for the United States to abandon Ukraine completely, because that will be seen as a sort of defeat for the US, a defeat for the West, and it will have profound security policy implications for Europe. That being said, there is no question that I have been skeptical of the US part of aid for Ukraine. And the US aid has been important, primarily on the military side. If you take the overall support for Ukraine, it is, of course, overwhelmingly European, but also other global partners. Japan has been important, for example. But the US has been important, and a decline in that support will be a substantial setback, no question.
Let's flip that question around and look at Kamala Harris. What does she potentially bring Europe?
Well, continuity, I would say. She would, in that sense, be a continuation of the policies that we've seen. She's committed to the security cooperation transatlantic. She's been coming to Europe a number of times, giving speeches of that content. That includes Ukraine and the policies associated with that. She's, of course, part of the drift that we've seen in US policies for quite some time in a slightly more protectionist direction. The Biden administration didn't undo a number of the protectionist measures that Trump one did. So from that point of view, yep, it's not going to be a worsening of the situation, but no distinct improvement either, I fear.
You mentioned briefly about the potential for trade disagreements. I mean, there have been many trade disagreements between Europe and the United States. What specifically are your concerns? Should there be, for example, a Trump administration, or should Kamala Harris come to power?
Well, I mean, what he talks about, I mean, remains to be seen. What happened if it was to be him that's expressed it? He said it's going to be a 10% tariff on all imports. That's a ban on all global trade affecting the United States. That includes Europe, that includes India. He said it's going to be 60% on everything coming from China. And the likelihood is, of course, that both the Europeans and the Chinese and others will retaliate. And then we are in a situation, there's been calculation done by different institutes, that will have a significant negative effect on global trade, and accordingly on global growth perspectives, affecting primarily the global south, by the way, apart from driving inflation in the US and other parts. So no question, his trade policies, which he claims are America first in the sense that they don't take into account at all the negative effects for the world as a whole.
I just want to revisit the question on Ukraine from a slightly different standpoint. Now, Trump does say that he has an equation with the Russian president. Nobody internationally, very few players are actually speaking to him. Prime Minister Modi is, of course, speaking to both Ukraine and Russia. But in terms of a US outreach to President Putin directly, do you not believe that that might be more feasible if it comes through Donald Trump, given the equation that he's had?
Not necessarily. I think we know fairly well what President Trump is intending to do, and I think he's told also Prime Minister Modi that he is in no mood for any ceasefire. He said that the only ceasefire that he can contemplate, and he said that both publicly and privately to people who'd be visiting him, is a ceasefire where Ukraine agrees to capitulate more or less on some of his key demands. That's the mood that he's in. Can President Trump change that? I doubt it. I think President Putin will see a Trump presidency as an opportunity to pursue that particular agenda. Then, of course, what will the Ukrainians do? Well, it's the Ukrainians who are fighting for their country. It's not the Americans that are fighting, it's the Ukrainians that are fighting. It will be a very difficult situation if he were to entertain agreeing to the Putin demands.
How do you assess the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now? Because just in the last couple of days, we've seen two reports. One, Russia continuing to gain ground, albeit in small areas, small pockets, of course, at the loss of a great deal of lives, but a real concern on how long Ukraine can actually sustain this. Because while Ukraine does have the support of the West presently, there is a concern over manpower available if this war stretches longer. Would you share that assessment on the ground situation?
I do share that assessment. I mean, the front line has been sort of overall fairly stable. As you noticed, there were in the late summer, there were significant Ukrainian advances in Kursk. There's been Russian advances in the last few weeks. But essentially, the Russians are holding roughly 70% of the territory of Ukraine. That has not changed really for the last 2 years or something like that. The manpower situation is what is most concerning from the Ukraine point of view. They're also dependent on ammunition and help they are getting from the West in different ways, but that seems to be less of a concern at the moment. Manpower, soldiers is a concern. They are mobilizing. But of course, it's a country of whatever they are, 30, 40 million versus 140 million. So the manpower potential is limited. Also, Russia has significant problems with manpower. Yes. They've had to pay a lot of money to get to replenish the front lines. They are losing the latest is that they're losing 1,100, 1,200, 1,300 people a day. So they need to recruit that number to stay stable. And then we have the North Koreans coming into the situation suddenly. Yeah.
Mr. Bildt, the other war, of course, is West Asia. Israel, the war in Lebanon that's taking place, Iran, against Israel at this stage. How do you assess potentially the policies of Kamala Harris and Trump should they come to power?
I think there are very different approaches. I think Kamala Harris, is highly likely that she would continue to pursue as a long-term solution, a two-state solution with Israel-Palestine. I consider that the only viable long-term solution, difficult as it is to achieve that. Trump, more uncertain. I think he was disengaged from the Middle East or West Asia. But at the same time, he has been, during Trump 1 period, he had been sort of fairly tolerant towards Israeli land acquisition, illegal land acquisition. So he would be more likely to go along with some of the more aggressive plans of Prime Minister Netanyahu. That's the way it looks if you listen to the rhetoric of the different contenders. Then Iran comes into the picture. And it looks like Iran is now planning some sort of counter-strike. It strikes, counter-strikes, strikes, counter-strikes. Between Israel and Iran, that would be most unfortunate. What is really needed is a ceasefire in Gaza, where the situation is catastrophic from the humanitarian point of view.
Yeah. Do you believe that China, at the end of the day, might just end up being America's primary foreign policy concern, adversary? The entire Asia-Pacific theater is very different right now. The U.S. bases a lot of their defenses on its Pacific theater. China is a growing economic power, the growing military power. There's the entire issue of Taiwan as well, the South China Seas as well. Do you believe that a lot of the foreign policy work of the next US president will be directed towards China?
I'm quite certain it will. I mean, the Americans have this expression that they said that Russia is it's a more temporary problem, and they see China as what they call the pacing challenge that the United States has to face. They fear the economic and technological might of China, although the Chinese are creating some difficulty for themselves in their economic policy, but that's a separate issue. And they are, of course, worried by aspects of the military buildup. Chinese ambitions in the South China Sea doesn't make it easier. So this, no doubt, is what security planners and strategic planners in Washington see as the #1 challenge for the United States in the years ahead. We Europeans are, of course, somewhat more concerned with Europe because we have a war going on here, a big war, and the outcome of that war will affect not only Europe but also Asia. The Japanese Kishida, the former prime minister, used to say that Ukraine today is East Asia tomorrow. So there is, of course, an interrelationship between those two strategic theaters at both ends of the Eurasian continent.
A final question to you as a former Prime Minister of Sweden. Sweden, of course, has in the past been valued and known for its entire independence throughout the years of the Cold War. Your foreign policy, your military policy was based on independence. But now we've seen, this entire effort at getting closer with NATO, that's taken place. And a sense that Swedish foreign policy is moving away from that non-alignment to being more closely associated with your fellow partners in Europe, West Europe. Was that even thinkable to you when you were Prime Minister some time back?
Well, it was highly thinkable when I was Prime Minister, because I was the Prime Minister that negotiated our entry into the European Union in the mid-90s. And that was, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire. And we wanted to be part of building a new order of peace and security in all of Europe. Up until that time, we had a Europe that was bitterly divided, the Iron Curtain running right through the middle of the country, half of Europe under tyranny and dictatorship, and we had the opportunity of building something new. That we've done with the European Union. But now we are suddenly faced with a new situation with an aggressive, revanchist Russia, outright military aggression in the heart of Europe. And then we had to take the step not only into the political alliance of the European Union, but also in the military alliance of NATO together with Finland. So that was caused by the changes that we see in Europe, that of course necessitates changes for a small country like Sweden.
Mr. Bildt, it's been wonderful speaking to you. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for speaking to NDTV.